Hi, I'm Peter J Rea. Welcome. Welcome to my second floor lair. Today's topic is Resalest Remarkable Books, number 17. Our first book today is Journey to Self-Realization by Paramahansa Yogananda, published in 1997. Now, this is the third in the trilogy of the long books by Paramahansa Yogananda, dealing with intended for the public, for anyone, and dealing with thoughts of the spiritual path and trying to live the right kind of life and living a life of a spiritual life and winning the battle of life, the battle of good against evil. And actually, in one of his other books, there's a quote that I wanted to share with you right now. When he wrote this quote, "He who truly understands that it is my America, my India, my Philippines, my Europe, my Africa, and so on, will never lack scope for a useful and happy life." So I was in the Philippines for many years, and it's nice. It's interesting how he talked about America and India being the two great countries. India, the spiritual great country, and India and America materially great. And then he includes Europe and Africa and the Philippines. So I think the Philippines has an important role to play in building God's kingdom on earth, or the evolution of this world to a better world. The next book is Dr. M.W. Lewis, the life story of one of the earliest American disciples of Paramahansa Yogananda, published by SelfRealization Fellowship in 1960. Dr. Lewis was one of the first people that Paramahansa Yogananda met in the United States and became a disciple, a follower. And he was a householder yogi. In other words, he had a family and worked, and he was from Boston. Early on, Yogananda spent time in Boston before eventually he settled in Los Angeles, his headquarters. So Dr. Lewis was one of the earliest people who knew Yogananda and followed his teachings and became a lifelong dedicated to the path of self-realization fellowship. The next book is Embraced by the Light by Betty J. Eady, published in 1992. This is a wonderful book. It's about a woman who had a near-death experience, and she journeyed, some people would call heaven, others call the astral world, and back. You know, it's interesting. A lot of people die, and people wonder what happens after death. Is death the end, or is there something that happens to us? Do we go to another world? And this woman, this book is about the idea that there is another world, that death is not the end. It's kind of a sad thought if death is the end of our existence. So she talks about her journey to the astral world, to heaven, and to testify that there is another world and a better world. And if we can overcome our worldly desires, we can stay there forever. We don't have to come back to this world, which is very troubled and ultimately has some. There are good and bad. There are definitely good times, but also hardships and tragedy and so forth. The next book is Of Time and the River by Thomas Wolfe, published in 1935. This is my favorite book by Thomas Wolfe. Interesting story. I started reading this in 1989 before I moved overseas, and I read about half. And then every time I came back to Cleveland, I would go to the Rocky River Public Library and check it out. And I would read, maybe 100 pages. It's a fairly long book. I believe about 600 pages. So I kept reading more and then returning it to the library. And then it got to the point where there wasn't much left to read, and I had a superstition that if I finished the book, I would not return to Rocky River. Of course, and I did finally decide to finish it in 1998, and so I read the last 9 pages, I checked it out of the library, and Anyway, this is a wonderful book. I've talked about him before. Very talented fellow and very interesting. Really, you could call him. My grandmother called him a mad genius. He's a very interesting fellow. The next book is Calves, From Fitch to Fratello by Joe Menzer and Bert Grafe, published in 1994. This is a book about the history of the Cleveland Cavaliers NBA team, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. He talks about the great season 1976, which was called the Miracle at Richfield, when the Cavaliers played at the Coliseum in Richfield, Ohio, and won they won the very exciting playoff round against the Washington Bullets, who were later changed their name to the Washington Wizards. And then they lost in the East Finals against the Boston Celtics after our center, Jim Jones, broke his foot. Anyway, then there's Ted Stepien, who was the owner, who was really terrible, and we're lucky we didn't lose the team because he was so destructive. And then, of course, The Shot by Michael Jordan in 1989, which won a playoff series and defeated the Cavs. I think it was the first round when they were a contender during the Michael Jordan era. Mel Turpin, they called him Dinner Bell Mel because he was tended to be overweight. Lenny Wilkins, who was a starting player early on when they played at the Cleveland Arena, their first home back in the early 70s on the east side of Cleveland. Mark Price, who was maybe my favorite player, definitely from the 1980s. It was this guy who moved the ball up the court. Luke Whitty, who was this fellow, generally a bench player, but the fans would chant for him. He played for Ohio State. Bingo Smith, who was a fine shooter back in the 70s. Brad Daugherty, our top center back in the late 80s. Dick Snyder, my friend's father called him Duke Snyder after the Brooklyn Dodgers player. Dick Snyder was a good shoot. Of course, Jim Jones and Nate Thurmond, who was a big help in the Miracle at Richfield season when they picked up in the middle of the year. And of course, this doesn't get into anything about the LeBron James era. Came out in 1994, but I really enjoyed to. I like to pay my respects to the former players from years past and have a sense of history about the team. The next book is Indians' Memories, The Most Memorable Heroes, Heartaches, and Highlights by Tim Long and Don Fox, published in 1997. This is a very short book, and you could read it in a day probably. It's a nice little book filled with anecdotes about the Cleveland Indians, this team that I'd say my primary, my first team in Cleveland sports, because, baseball is the game you play in summer in the United States. When you're a kid, especially in Cleveland, it's cold in the winter, and you look forward to summer vacation and the warm weather and playing baseball in the outdoors. The next book is Brown's Memories, also by Tim Long. He wrote this just by himself and published in 1996. And the thing I liked about this book is he talks a lot about the championship teams. The Cleveland Browns initially were in the All-American Football Conference and won 4 championships there, 1946, 47, 48, and 49. Then they joined the NFL, and their first year, 1950, they won the championship, 1950. And then I also won in 1954, 1955, and 1964, their last championship. So, Otto Graham, who was the quarterback, he actually had a 10-year career, and every year the Browns played in the championship game, and they won 7 championships. And of the Browns' 8 titles, 7 were won with Otto Graham as their quarterback. So he talks about Paul Brown, who really started the Cleveland Browns back in 1946. Jim Brown, the tremendous running back in the late 50s and early 60s. Brian Sipe, who was the star quarterback in the late 70s, early 80s on the Cardiac Kids team in 1980. Bernie Kosar, in the late 80s, quarterback who got the Browns to the AFC title game 3 years, 86, 87, and 89. And Frank Minifield and so many more players on the Cleveland Browns. Since 1946, they've been playing. First year, my father came to Cleveland after graduating from Oberlin College. The next book is Endless Summers, The Fall and Rise of the Cleveland Indians by Jack Torrey, 1995. You can see that I was really getting into, well, I was reading all these books on Cleveland sports because I was in Manila, Philippines. I came home to visit and bought all these books and brought them back so I could read about the team, since I couldn't really watch the games on television since I was on the other side of the world. This is a very good book. And it talks about the fatal error the Cleveland Indians made in the late 50s when attendance went down and they had a little bit of trouble with income. Their income was down because of ticket sales being down. And then they decided to cut their budget for the minor league teams. They call the so-called farm teams. And the minor league teams is where you get new players. You know, the young players who you develop and then eventually bring up to the major league team. And when they did this, they were really doomed, because this is how you get new good players, and that was their fatal error. And then throughout the 1960s and 70s, the Indians were pretty bad. And then this book talks about how Dick Jacobs, who was the owner, and Hank Peters was a general manager, and John Hart was also a general manager, and how those three fellows helped the Cleveland Indians become a strong contender by the middle of the 1990s. So, and although they didn't win a World Series, but they certainly gave the fans a lot of thrills starting in 1994. The next book is When All the World Was Brownstown, Cleveland's Browns in the Championship Season of '64 by Terry Pluto, published in 1997. Terry Pluto is this famous local guy from Akron who wrote sports books on American sports, and he wrote this book on the 1964 Cleveland Browns, their last championship season. Of course, Paul Brown had been fired, but he kind of put together this team. Blanton Collier was the coach of the team. Jim Brown was the tremendous running back. Frank Ryan was the quarterback, and Art Modell was the owner. So 1964, I don't really remember because I was only 4 years old, and they won at the old Cleveland Municipal Stadium. I believe it was, this is the anniversary, 1964. This has been 53 years since then, and haven't won a championship, and now looks like we're not going to win a game this year. We're 0-15, but hope springs eternal for the sports fan. The next book is Burying the Curse by Terry Pluto, 1995. This is a book about the 1995 Cleveland Indians who made it to the World Series. Had a tremendous hitting team. They had a lot of big bats who could hit home runs and hit doubles. They had Albert Bell, who was their big slugger, Carlos Baerga, the second baseman, Kenny Lofton, the fast fellow in center field, could steal bases, Dennis Martinez, the veteran pitcher, starting pitcher, Orel Hershiser, who had been a star and helped the Dodgers win the World Series in 1988, Jim Thome, who eventually hit more than 600 career home runs, Manny Ramirez, another big slugger, Eddie Murray, who had been a fine player for the Baltimore Orioles, Omar Vizquel, the shortstop, who was a very good defensive player. So, 1995, they faced the Atlanta Braves in the World Series, who had those tremendous pitching staff. So we didn't win, but still, it was a wonderful year. 1995 Cleveland Indians. The next book is City of Champions: The Story of the 1948 Cleveland Barons, Browns, and Indians by Kevin O'Connell, published in 1997. So in 1948, the Cleveland won 3 championships. The Cleveland Barons were the American Hockey League, won the championship, and then, of course, the Indians were World Series champions, and then the Cleveland Browns in the AAFC. So that was our big year. And this was the motto that I kind of got from the title of this book. I've been promoting Cleveland City of Champions, and kind of started from this title of this book, Positive Thinking. And different characters. Bun Cook, who was the coach of the Barons. They used to play over at the old arena. Cleveland was really a hockey town back then. Lou Boudreau, the player-manager of the Indians. Bill Veeck was the tremendous owner of the Cleveland Indians, very creative and innovative. Larry Doby, the first African-American baseball player in the American League, and really was a big help. Paul Brown, of course, the coach of the Browns. Otto Graham, the quarterback, and Lou Groza, the kicker for the Browns. So this was some year. And it's kind of forgotten. The Cleveland Cavaliers have become Cleveland's winter sports team. But in the old days, Cleveland was really a hockey town, and the Cleveland Barons were a tremendous team. And then 1948, all three teams won championships, so that was really something. The next book is Maiden, Voyages, Writings of Women Travelers, edited by Mary Morris in 1993. This was given to me by my friend Dr. Danko, and as the title suggests, it's about women who traveled and wrote about their travels, and this is all compiled in this volume. Each chapter is by a different woman and I thought the best one was about this lady who she described that she said she muddled through Madagascar. Now what an interesting place that would be to go to. This very large island, which is considered a part of Africa, although it's not in the continent. It's huge. And I believe they have the baobab tree. I think that's where it's a native. And we have the Cleveland Botanical Garden, they have a cement baobab tree. I thought it was real. It turns out it wasn't. It was just made out of cement, and I was communing with it, and I didn't really know that. So anyway, these are interesting. These women who are going to different places around the world and writing about it. It's good to travel. It's good to write so you can share what you've experienced. The next book is Primary Colors. The author is anonymous, published in 1996. This is a book about the U.S. presidential election in 1992, and specifically about Bill Clinton's bid to become the Democratic Party nominee for president. And Bill Clinton, what a fascinating topic. What a talented fellow. Such a smart guy and so charismatic. Of course, he had a problem. He was married, and he had these relations with other women. So that was but he was able to overcome that. He was such a likable guy. It was hard to dislike Bill Clinton because he was very endearing. And he was so knowledgeable. If you listen to his speeches, boy, the guy was smart as heck. He obviously read a lot, and he learned a lot. He really, those speeches are very substantive, very full of information, and he's such a nice fellow. He's very, very personable, very outgoing, and this book really talks about how his personality and how effective he was with people. A real people person, and he actually didn't need to sleep very much. He seemed to get energy from interacting with the public. He'd have these interactions where he drew energy from people because he was so positive, and people reacted positively to him. The next book is Three Soldiers by John Dos Passos, published in 1921. Now, this is about the First World War and the experiences of these fellows. And, of course, that was a very, very tough war, the trench warfare, and, they go over the top and they'd attack, and there were all these, and then the middle between the two trenches, the German trench on the east, and on the west the French and British and later American trenches, and all these dead bodies, guys that get killed in no man's land, and there are all these rats and these poor fellows who had to live in the trenches, which filled up with mud, and it was very, very tough. John Dos Passos did a good job of describing what those fellows went through. The next book is Kim by Rudyard Kipling, published in 1901. This is a book about India. Rudyard Kipling wrote a lot of books. He was British, and he was writing about British India. And I love the references to meditation and yoga in this book. There was a good story about Rudyard Kipling that he was giving a speech, and one of the people in the audience had a question, or I guess it was a question and answer time, and the fellow said, "Mr. Kipling, I understand that you've been paid $100 for every word you have written. How about a $100 word? Can you give us a $100 word?" And Kipling and the guy held up a $100 bill, and Kipling walked over and took the $100 bill from the fellow, and he said, "Thanks." I thought that was a good story. The next book is The Great Railway Bazaar by Paul Theroux, published in 1975. And again, this is another of Thoreau's train travel books. And he left London by train, traveled through Europe, and the Balkan Peninsula, which I think is one of the most interesting. It's the most unknown peninsulas in the world because it's very big, and it's bounded by the Black Sea, the Adriatic Sea, and I believe the Aegean Sea. And anyway, he made his way in these different interesting countries over there, Romania and former Yugoslavia, and so forth. And he made it to Turkey. Just imagine, all by train, and then Iran and India, and into Southeast Asia. So all by train. And I guess he had to travel by ship to Japan, and then traveled in Japan by train, and then he made his way up to Siberia and came home on the Trans-Siberian Railway. And so this is really something all the way. So what a trip, this fellow. And anyway, he does a good job of... Obviously, he makes the trips and then writes about it. Very fine author. The next book is The Gifts of the Jews by Thomas Cahill, published in 1998. You know, I bought this book at Cleveland Hopkins Airport, and I was standing in line there. I was picking up somebody. I think that's when I met Otto Graham, actually. I didn't really know how much he had done for Cleveland. And this book talks about Abraham, the founder of the nation of Israel. Moses, of course, who led the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt back to freedom in Israel. David, who was a great king of ancient Israel, and his son Solomon, who was another great king. And there's a quote that I wrote down from the book, quote, "It is a tricky business to take the foreskin of a man without his consent." And then there's also talk about Saul, King Saul, and then David. Okay. The next book is The 100 Secret Senses by Amy Tan, published in 1995. Yeah, you know, I was reading this book in the Hong Kong airport in transit from Manila to Cleveland. I felt very trendy. I felt like a cool guy reading Amy Tan in the Hong Kong airport. When I read this book, I was current with Amy Tan. I'd read all of her books, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, the book talks about reincarnation and past lives. And of course, Amy Tan is the wonderful Chinese-American author who writes about being a Chinese-American woman in the United States and about life in China for her ancestors and especially for women. This is mostly the experiences of Chinese women and Chinese-American women. The next book is Emily Climbs by Lucy Maud Montgomery, published in 1995. This is the second in the Emily series, second of 3, and it talks about a controversial minister, Christian minister, who said this, quote, "There may be some good in Buddhism." So just imagine, back in 1925, among Christians in the West, there wasn't much respect for the wisdom of religions from Asia, but this fellow was ahead of the curve, so he did a good job. The next book is Majda, The Family and Early Life of Paramahansa Yogananda by Sananda Lal Ghosh, published in 1980. Now, Majda was the boyhood nickname of Paramahansa Yogananda, so this is a book written by his brother and about his childhood. So it's interesting when Paramahansa Yogananda was growing up in India back at the end of in the 1800s and into the 20th century. So this is interesting because this Paramahansa Yogananda is the most important person in my life because he really helped me so much, helped me to overcome depression and to be happy and to be productive. And so I owe everything to him. So, and Self-Realization Fellowship. The next book is Emily's Quest by Lucy Maud Montgomery, published in 1927. Well, this is the third and last of the Emily series, and so I finished that. I finished the Anne books and now the Emily books, and the next series is Pat of Silver Bush. I'm not sure if I think I had both of them, but I don't think I read either of them. So I think this was the end of the line for me with Lucy Maud Montgomery. Anyway, it's a nice book. It has a happy ending with Ilsa and Perry. Ilsa was with Perry and Emily with Teddy. Apparently there was two couples. And the emotional ups and downs in life. And when I finished this, I thought I would go on to the Pat series, but I didn't. Anyway, wonderful stories of Prince Edward Island, Canada, in the early part of the 20th century. The next book is Outrage by Dale Dye, published in 1988. Now, this is a good book. It deals with what happened in Beirut, Lebanon in 1983. There had been a lot of fighting and trouble. There was war. And the U.S. American Marines were there as a part of a peacekeeping mission. Tragically, this was the early days of this issue with Islamic Jihad, which culminated with the 9/11 bombings in New York City. Anyway, this suicide bomber drove a truck into the compound where the American Marines were and blew up this truck full of explosives. And 241 American Marines were killed. So this was really, really tragic. And as I said, one of the early events in the problems with Islamic Jihad, these Muslims who are using violence to promote their agenda. And so it was tough. Ronald Reagan was the president back then, and this was a tough situation. And I believe we pulled out of Lebanon after that. The next book is Toward the End of Time by John Updike, published in 1997. This was, at the time, his latest book. I think I bought it at National Bookstore at Vera Mall. It's a futuristic novel set in 2020 New England. And it's about this fellow who is a sick old man at the end of his life. And it led me to wonder if John Updike himself was sick. So it's more of the same. You know, John Updike's a fine author, and he certainly writes very well and does a good job. The next book is Recessional by James A. Michener, published in 1994. And this is a story of old age and death. He set this in a nursing home. And so it's an important topic. You know, unless we die suddenly at a younger age, we will all face old age and death, and so it's an important topic to get into. It made me wonder and actually Michener was at the end of his life when he wrote this, near the end of his life. I believe he died not too long after this, in the middle of the 90s. So you know, he's a wonderful author. He's this man who was like a father to me. Very, very good man, James A. Michener. The next book is An Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jameson, published in 1995. This is a book about manic depression, you know, which is a form of mental illness. These people, they have a lot of energy. Sometimes they're very energetic, and then later, other times they're very depressed, very low energy, and they seem to fluctuate, going up and down. And I have to say that it's possible that I've had this. I've definitely had depression. And I've also had times when my energy's been very, very high. And that's the thing. It's interesting when you have a lot of energy. The main thing is to be respectful of other people. You know, it's good to have energy and intelligence and creativity. But if you are in that state, you know, make sure respect people, because sometimes when people get into trouble, they do stupid things because they just have so much energy, and you have to that's where you really need wisdom. And hopefully you can use that energy in a constructive fashion and for some good purpose and be creative and get something accomplished. The next book is Kent State, What Happened and Why by James A. Michener, published in 1971. Now, this is a book about the events that took place on May 4th, 1970 at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, when this is during the Vietnam War, and there were protests against the war, and the National Guard was called in because it got pretty chaotic. 4 young people were shot and killed by the National Guard. So it was tragic. And so missioners were writing about what happened and trying to understand this, because certainly we want to avoid these types of things happening again. So, and it's a very meticulous, thoughtful report on the Kent State tragedy. Well, looks like we're out of time. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it, and hope you find a good book to read. Live long and prosper. May the force be with you. God bless you. God bless the Philippines, America, and the whole world. See you next time.